They called him in many ways. They called him the boss of the two worlds, but he was not a boss. He defined himself as a soldier. They called him Don Massino, but he preferred Massino. They called him a traitor, and he often did not respond. He turned his back on those who defined him as such. But if they defined him as repentant, here is this. No to this, he retorted. He said, I am not a repentant. I am a man who has made choices, has completed his own life cycle. There comes a time in life when you need to change without denying anything. So without regret, but admitting to having made mistakes. He was Tommaso BUSCETTA, the man whose revelations were fundamental in dismantling the old Cosa Nostra. And this is his story. To this he would retort, saying, I am not a repentant. I am a man who has made choices, who has completed his own life's journey. Our story concerning Tommaso BUSCETTA begins in 1980. It begins when BUSCETTA realizes that the old Cosa Nostra is ending. By the end of the 70s, BUSCETTA had been in prison, had made 9 poisonings, had strengthened old relationships, for example with Francis Turratello, the king of Milan's nightlife. We have already discussed this in a specific video. On that occasion, he had also been approached by the Red Brigades, and he himself then sought a relationship with the Red Brigades, not for ideological reasons. BUSCETTA was never a left-wing man. In fact, one could almost say that he was never a real political man. It was the period of terrorism. It was the period of the kidnapping of the Honorable Aldo Moro, the president of the Christian democracy. Kidnapped after the massacre of his escort in Via Fani in Rome, he was found dead after more than a month and a half of abduction. BUSCETTA had been tasked through various stages which had seen gangsters, maravitosi, brigades in prison, but also men of the services and carabinieri involved, like General Carlo Alberto della Chiesa, to find the prison of Aldo Moro. It hadn't gone well, but BUSCETTA had understood at that moment, probably, that the relationships of the Maravita with politics were degenerating, and that within the same Maravita of Cosa Nostra, a second phase was being prepared. Having escaped from the semi-freedom regime in February 1980, BUSCETTA had returned to Palermo under the protection of Nino and Ignazio. Salvo, the cousins, Salvo, the great tax collectors of Sicily, the two entrepreneurs who, on the mandate of the state, collected taxes on the island. At the time, Nino and Ignazio Salvo were trusted men of Stefano Bontate, the prince of Villa La Grazia, the head of the old Cosa Nostra. An elegant man, a man who liked to command, but in a very intelligent way. Massino, who had never been a natural leader, had never wanted to do so. However, he was an advisor, we could call him that, a man who was asked for advice. Why? Because he was intelligent, and he had demonstrated that intelligence not only by adapting to various situations. Think about the fact that before 1980, he had already been in America. He had learned English, he had already been to Brazil, he had begun to take root in Brazil, he had learned Portuguese. He had married a beautiful Brazilian woman, the daughter of a well-known politician. Massino was a powerful person because he knew how to think. One of the few within Cosa Nostra. The others were Bontate and Pippo Calò, among other things, head of the Porta Nuova family, the family to which Massino himself initially belonged, BUSCETTA. Soon after, he would have made the leap of the quail. He would have betrayed his old friends, his old companions, his old allies. Because the second great mafia war was on the horizon. To understand exactly what the mafia wars were, we need to take a substantial step back. We need to go back to the 60s, to the period when the old mafia, the rural one, the one that had been fought by Prefect Mori on Mussolini's orders, had reorganized itself. It had become a different mafia, still rooted in the territory, still very strong, but with completely diversified interests. There was no longer the protection of the small farm worker rather than the entrepreneur or the farmer. No, gentlemen, the new mafia aimed at money and power through increasingly risky trades, starting with drug trafficking. From the 60s onwards, Sicily becomes a crossroads of that traffic that starts from Afghanistan, passes through Turkey, where it materializes. The base morphine, it brings increasingly larger, heavier loads to the ports of Sicily. It arrives at the refineries in Cinisi, not far from Palermo, the territory of Don Tano Badalamenti Tano, seated as depicted by Peppino Impastato. And then from there, it takes flight to the United States of America. This enormous process, which begins in the 60s branches, out in the 70s, explodes in the 80s. He will become known to the general public thanks to the Pizza Connection. And within the Pizza Connection, there is also a part specifically for him. For Don Massino, who had left Sicily after the end of the first great mafia war. He had already left before, but he had some problems. He was arrested for a minor incident along the way. It wasn't exactly about drugs. It was still smuggling, arrested, convicted, and that conviction, years later, would cost him dearly in several trials because it was thrown back at him because he had never mentioned it every time he was called to the bar. Massino had been in the United States. He had brought part of his family with him. He had started working. Massino was good. He was the son of a glassmaker. He had learned the trade very well. Initially, he also worked in the world of glass, of mirrors. Then he had opened some pizzerias. Through those pizzerias and many other pizzerias, the drug channel would have passed from the United States. He had returned to Italy. He had been convicted. Then he had moved to Brazil, we have already said. There he had rebuilt another life. The real problem with Massino is that he always liked women very much, perhaps too much. If within the old Cosa Nostra there was a behavioral code that required associates to be faithful to their consort, Massino had other plans. He had been married, but he had made other families and had not as many children as his father. Did you know that Tommaso BUSCETTA was the last of 17 children? It was a different time, a different Sicily, where poverty was also fueled by very large families, where they couldn't then put bread on the table for everyone. Massino always tried to free himself from this poverty, working in his own way, a bit legally, a bit illegally. We return to that spring of 1980 when Salvatore Inzerillo, Stefano Bontatti's right-hand man, asked Massino BUSCETTA to align himself with the Prince of Villagrizia to bring the whole Portanuova family to the side of the old Cosa Nostra, because the head-on clash with Totorina's Corleonesi, Bernardo, Provenzano, Luciano, can no longer be postponed. Massino does not intend to get his hands dirty. Massino prefers to organize an alliance. He knows it won't last long, but it's always better than returning Sicily to the 60s, to Michele Cavataio's war against the old bosses, a war that ended with the Ciaculi massacre and with heavy measures from the Italian State Republic. If they wanted to continue doing business, littering the streets with corpses wouldn't exactly be the best calling card. BUSCETTA had tried to get all the bosses at the same table to talk, and then he had returned to Brazil, but without bringing all his children with him, the older ones. They had stayed there, including Benedetto, a fragile son, a son who had also experienced the tragedy of heroin, and who had stayed in Sicily, theoretically entrusted to the guardianship of Pippo Calò. Here, Benedetto would have been one of the mafia victims of the Lupara Bianca, disappearances into thin air, without any more traces of the disappeared person being found. When BUSCETTA returns to Brazil, his wife Cristina from the children also has another child, the last Stefano, who is named so in honor of his old friend Stefano. Bontate begins to gather increasingly worse signals. The mafia war breaks out. It breaks out in a blazing fray. Bontate is first killed with a trap stopped at a traffic light. The killers with the Kalashnikov shoot at him. They massacre him. Then Inzerillo at his lover's house. Inzerillo's son threatens to react, to avenge his father at the funeral. Giuseppe Greco, known as Scarpuzzetta, is kidnapped. They cut off his arm and then shoot him. It's a signal that needs to be given to everyone. One must not rebel against the new power of the Corleonesi. Tano Badalamenti, Tano Seduto, goes to Brazil to try to involve BUSCETTA. BUSCETTA asks him to intervene, to become the peacemaker, to end it here, to stop this war that is doing so much harm. However, BUSCETTA doesn't want to know. He's worried. He's worried because Several of his relatives disappear into thin air in Italy, but he doesn't want to return to Italy. A fears that once he lands at the airport, a trap will be waiting for him. Or perhaps someone plans to involve him in an ambush against someone else, or he gets sold to one of the two factions as a sacrificial victim. His old friend, Pippo Collò, has already chosen. He chose to betray his old friends, his old comrades, and to side entirely with the Corleonesi. Tommaso BUSCETTA sees his life radically change soon after when he makes a mistake in Brazil, and it's not the one to call home because in his phone calls he always proves to be very cautious. He frequently travels, utilizing public payphones and regularly changing locations. He is betrayed by the presence of another boss, Antonio Bardellino, boss of the Camorra, among other things at war against those Nuvoletta, who are the only Neapolitans affiliated with the Cosa Nostra. Bardellino hides in Rio de Janeiro, in the same building, in the same apartment where BUSCETTA lives with his family. The Brazilian police try to frame Bardellino, who, however, manages to escape before the raid, but they notice the presence of BUSCETTA. It's October 23, 1983. BUSCETTA, who in the meantime has gone to his other Brazilian home in Sao Paulo, is arrested along with his wife, Cristina Guimarães, is taken to jail, interrogated, beaten, tortured, threatened with death. Even his wife is threatened with death. The Brazilians don't use the velvet glove. On the contrary, they use the studded glove against him. They consider him a drug trafficker. They want to make him talk. They want to understand where the money is, where the cocaine has ended up. BUSCETTA does not talk, but in Italy there is someone who is very interested in Tommaso BUSCETTA. That someone is the prosecutor's office of the Republic of Palermo. After the death of Rocco Cinici, torn apart by a bomb, there is a very alert, very intelligent judge raised in Cinici's school who has taken over the investigation. His name is Falcone, and he would really like to talk to Tommaso BUSCETTA. BUSCETTA initially does not want to be extradited to Italy. When Brazil informs him that extradition has been granted, BUSCETTA swallows a small amount of poison that he kept under the nails of one hand to get himself admitted to the hospital, suffering from convulsions. After a non-fatal dose and brief hospitalization, BUSCETTA is put on a plane. With him is Gianni De Gennaro, the future chief of police. He's brought back to Italy, landing at Rome's airport on July 15, 1984. And from that moment forward, the story of the war between the Italian state and Cosa Nostra changes radically, because in the talks, they are not interrogations, they are actual conversations that Don Messino has with Judge Falcone. A world opens up, a hidden world. BUSCETTA talks. He tells how Cosa Nostra is structured. The pyramid structure at the base, the soldiers who constitute the families, districts and their bosses, and above all, the commission, what is colloquially called the dome, the one that makes the key decisions. These are the secrets that BUSCETTA brings to the Italian judiciary, and they are the secrets that gradually allow everything to be revealed. The so-called Operation San Michele. 366 arrest warrants executed, some in Palermo, others in Rome, Milan, Frosinone, some. In prisons, it dismantles much of Cosa Nostra's structure, though not everyone is arrested. Rina Provenzano are some of those who escaped justice for several years. Pippo Collò, who in Rome hides behind the pseudonym of Mario Aglialoro. An alleged engineer escapes but is captured shortly after. A new work model is established, that of the anti-mafia pool. A new procedural model is established. A new process is established and instructed, the one that will become the Max trial. The one carried out in the bunker room of Palermo, specifically created within a prison. The trial against Cosa Nostra, an epical event, is accompanied by the statements of two justice collaborators. One indeed is Tommaso BUSCETTA, the other is Totuccio Contorno. Salvatore Contorno, a Cosa Nostra killer, also known as Coriolano della Foresta and Prima. Luce, who had already sniffed the air. He had been the victim of an assassination attempt by Scarpezetta himself, and in the end, he too had decided to cooperate. Later on, they will be joined by other collaborators, Francesco Marino Manoia, the chemist of Cosa Nostra, the one who refined the drugs on behalf of Cosa Nostra. And then Calderone Antonino Calderone, brother of Giuseppe from the Cosa of Catania. It is these men who, with their revelations, allow the maxi trial to take place. Of course, a maxi trial that will subsequently be undermined in other stages of judgment. But that will generally confirm the accusatory system set up by the Palermo prosecutor's office, from the office led by Judge Falcone. And it must be said that the relationship between Don Massino and Falcone will always remain very solid, even from a distance. They will only never agree on one thing for a long time. Tommaso BUSCETTA refuses to name the political contacts of Cosa Nostra, says the time is not ripe, says you need to have patience, understand when it will be time to speak. He will do it after Falcone's death, after the attacks, after the bombing season. Yes, he will spill the beans and name names, beginning with Nino and Ignazio Salvo. Then other collaborators will also arrive, like Geraci and Mutolo, who will talk, for example, about the role of Vito Ciancimino, already mentioned earlier, or about that of Salvo Lima, a very powerful reference in the area of what is probably the most powerful politician in Italy, Giulio Andreotti. Andreotti's figure intersects with that of Massimo BUSCETTA during a trial. The trial for the murder of journalist Mino Pecorelli. We have already talked about it. In another video, BUSCETTA reveals that Montat in Zerillo Caloglia had made revelations that Mino Pecorelli was killed on the orders of the cousins, except on input from the Andreotti current. Because Pecorelli himself knew too much, he knew too many things. He was determined to publish some of the secrets he was aware of. Embarrassing secrets for Andreotti. However, Andreotti's defense would have succeeded over the course of various trials in instilling the worm of doubt in the judges. A doubt about the credibility of Massimo BUSCETTA as a justice collaborator, dredging up small contradictions, dredging up that first conviction for smuggling, dredging up old facts. The statements of BUSCETTA and one of the Magliana turncoats, Maurizio Battino, are dismantled piece by piece, until adding to the last sentence that of acquittal, which dismantles the conviction in the Court of Appeal. Tommaso BUSCETTA spends the last years of his life between life in America, where he entered the Witness Protection Program by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. New identities, new homes, which are constantly changing. Whenever there is a hint that someone might have recognized Massino and his family, and the trips to Italy to testify in trials. In 1994, BUSCETTA, already ill, gives an interview to journalist Ennio Remondino, and this interview will shake the Italian public opinion. It's an interview about the relationship between Cosa Nostra and politics. BUSCETTA will continue to be seen as the boss of the two worlds. The label that did not belong to him, he was never a boss. Like a man caught between his criminal past and his present as a justice collaborator. Suffering from terminal cancer, BUSCETTA dies on April 2nd, 2000 in Miami, Florida, with his wife Christina and his youngest children by his side. Buried under a false name in North Miami. Even today, many years after his death, BUSCETTA remains a key figure in the complex relationship between the fight against the mafia, mafia collusion, and the various factions of Cosa Nostra. Glassmaker, craftsman, pizzaiolo, forestry, entrepreneur, but also accused of drug trafficking, cigarette smuggling, accused of being a criminal boss or part of a stratified and pyramidal criminal organization. Ultimately, Tommaso BUSCETTA was a Sicilian man from Porta Nuova, a mafioso hailing from Palermo. But he also wanted to communicate something. Speaking with Giovanni Falcone, he simply wanted to say that society, even the Sicilian one, even the Padernitan one, changes. And after the taste of the powder or powders, of the drug that poisons the soul before the body, Cosa Nostra was no longer the same. It had changed. It had become something to beat. In his perfect Italian, but also in his good English and his excellent Portuguese, BUSCETTA managed to communicate all of this. While Totuccio Contorno struggled to speak Italian, he spoke almost only in Sicilian. BUSCETTA was aware of the importance of words. He wanted to make himself understood well, and he spent what remained of his life doing so, to open many people's eyes to the risk deposed by the mafia, well aware that he had consciously taken that risk since he was a boy, both in becoming the trade union between the various accounts, incomes, and even choosing to accept the qualification of trader.